The Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference is coming to Dallas, Texas, February 16, 17, and 18 in 2018. If you know of a better way to get the latest insider knowledge about crypto, to hear directly from the top minds in this field, to interact personally with 800 fellow crypto lovers, hodlers, investors, miners, traders, developers, and founders, then I'd like to hear about it. If you don't, then you don't want to miss out. Register today for the Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference. Go to bitcoinsuperconference.com and register today as a super early bird to get the lowest rates on tickets and hotel rooms. That's bitcoinsuperconference.com.
Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost Here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hi, this is Richard Jacobs with Future Tech Podcast. My guest right now is Werner van Rooyen, Head of Marketing at Luno, Luno. Werner, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for the call.
Yeah, no problem. So tell us, what does Luno do?
Sure thing. So Luno is a Bitcoin platform. I can maybe say like what the short-term and the long-term aim of Luno is, but at least right now, Luno is a Bitcoin platform. And we are currently active in a bunch of different markets. We originally started in Singapore and South Africa, and then after that expanded to Nigeria, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And as of Tuesday, we're active throughout Europe. So all in all, about 40 countries. And then our core business is allowing people to convert between the real physical world of finance today and this future of finance and digital currencies. So we enable the conversion between local currencies and Bitcoin. And then once somebody is in this new financial system of Bitcoin, we allow them to store and transfer and use. And again, whenever they need to convert it back to a local currency, we facilitate those services.
Are you acting essentially as an on-ramp for people to go from fiat to crypto, or is it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's pretty much that point between local currencies, between fiat currencies and digital currencies. We find that that's often the point of most interest for a lot of people, but it's also the point of a lot of friction and confusion. So I think if you rewind the clock a little bit, like a lot of people who got interested in Bitcoin, let's say circa 2012, 2013, thereabouts, when a lot of Bitcoin platforms were founded, it was largely a technical audience that were looking for Bitcoin services at that time. So you'll have those types of platforms tend to be largely technical, and they largely focus on a trader market. Whereas that's a little bit of where our origins lie, because we were also founded in 2013 and also catered to that early adopter audience. But we've evolved to the point where we actually only focused on creating very, very simple products. So a very simple mechanism of saying, like, I have this much, and let's say Malaysian ringgit or euros or Nigerian naira, and I want to just convert that instantly into Bitcoin without the need of knowing how, let's say, market liquidity and order books and candle charts and things like that work. So we're aiming to make a very simple product and also a very mobile product, which I think a lot of earlier platforms, that's maybe not their core focus, but it's definitely where we are right now and what we're aggressively pursuing.
What kind of users are you getting on your platform? Is this they're probably not, technophiles. They're probably people that heard about Bitcoin and just want to get involved, or is it different?
Yeah. It very much depends on the market. So the origins of our company is very much in emerging markets. I think that Bitcoin holds a lot of potential in the short term, let's say even for established markets, but I think in the long run, the benefit of digital currencies, I think that it might have a bigger impact over time in emerging markets. So those are the markets that we started out in. And the consumer in those markets is maybe a little bit different from, let's say, the early adopter consumers that you might find elsewhere, let's say in the US or even in Europe. So, I mean, to look at the consumer, you kind of need to look at what they want to do with Bitcoin. Like, what is their purpose? Like, what pain point does it solve? And I mean, Bitcoin does three things well. It's a great way of decentralizing finance. So if you don't want a central entity to control your money, there's an element of that, I'd say, in our markets, maybe not that much. The second use case is using it as a means of payment. And the only reason why people would use Bitcoin today as a means of payment is really because they have no other option. The existing financial system for payments, at least, is and in the rich world in particular, is very established. I mean, it's a painless experience for me, even here in South Africa. If I need to go to the supermarket and pay for groceries, I just take out my credit card, and the transaction is done in 5 seconds. That said, in some of the emerging markets, it's not always possible for people to use their credit cards when they have access to it. A lot of people, for instance, in Nigeria, one of our key markets, they can't use their credit cards basically anywhere else in the world. So if they want to purchase from the US, their cards automatically get declined because of high fraud rates. So Bitcoin is often the only way for them to pay. So I'd say the second step up of why people would use it is they don't have another way of paying. But for the most part, I think our consumers use Bitcoin or buy Bitcoin. It's pretty much the same reason what you see elsewhere in the world, and that's this hedge against, let's say, currency depreciation, or hopefully for that, buying into an alternative asset that might be worth more in the future. I think a lot of people, again, in emerging markets, they've been feeling the crunch a lot in the last 5 years. A lot of our markets have lost more than 50% and even more of their currency value against the US dollar and against the euro in the past few years, whereas Bitcoin against the US dollar and the euro has done pretty well. So I think initially our earlier customers, they were also the techie early adopter. They would integrate an API with their trading bot, that type of customer. But the vast majority of customers today, I would say, are retail, regular consumers who either have an interest in allocating a small percentage of their portfolio, their investment portfolio, into Bitcoin, be it because in the hope of that it will grow, or maybe in the hope that at least they will just protect against devaluation, currency devaluation.
Are you seeing anyone use the platform to get out of their home country's currency and get into another one as the gateway, or do they tend to stay in Bitcoin?
Yeah, that's a really good question. All of our initial markets, and these are again Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, Nigeria. All of those markets actually have capital control. So it means those governments and central banks actually restrict the amount of capital of local currency that individuals from those countries are legally allowed to take out of the country. It's very much the same in China. It's not a market that we're active in, but some people speculate that it's a big use case for Bitcoin in those markets. So our data shows that people don't really use it to move money out of countries. It's something that we're obligated to monitor for and to see if people are actually trying to circumvent capital controls. So the data doesn't show that they're doing it, because I think there's existing rails in most of the countries, and most of the countries have been opening up and increasing their foreign capital allocation, as they call it, that people can buy. So primarily what we see is actually buy and hold. People would buy cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, the vast majority, because I mean it's still the digital currency with the widest brand recognition. So people would mostly buy Bitcoin, and then up until the time when they feel, oh wow, okay, I might want to sell this because it might just be worth at that time than it was in the past. Some people buy other cryptocurrencies. We've seen quite a bit especially in Malaysia, we've seen quite a bit of conversion or movement from our platform onto other platforms to buy Ether in particular. And I think a lot of that was due to the recent run up that we saw in the past few months of ICOs and people just buying into various investments. You know, some of them obviously great, and some of them probably not so great. But at least what the data shows is most people are still sticking to Bitcoin.
Are you going to try to expand to every country in the world, or are there certain is there a certain path of expansion you guys are on right now? Desperately need what you're doing, or ones that you need to stay away from?
I think we're pretty much on target of where our expansion plans, were drawn up, and they get revised from time to time as you get more government and regulatory certainty or uncertainty in certain markets. That very much drives your expansion plan. So we're definitely not interested in being in every country in the world. I think that adage of if everybody is your customer, then ultimately nobody is. And I think that holds true for international, geographical distribution too. So right now, I think what at least what happened up until this point, let's say the pre-European expansion, was there was very strong demand for our products in our markets. And we greatly refined and improved and simplified our products in those markets. And in all those markets, we're pretty much the leader, at least in terms of trading volumes and wallet downloads. With the exception of Indonesia, we might say second fiddle. But the focus is very much right now on Europe. So as I mentioned earlier, on Tuesday we announced our Series B fundraising round that was closed recently, and the lead investors, Balderton Capital, which is I believe the largest VC fund in Europe. So definitely the next stretch is for us to cater and localize for that market and expand greatly in that market. Markets that we're not interested in are markets like China and potentially Russia. I mean, these are just in the world of e-commerce and fintech. They're very much they've got a lot of potential, but also they tend to favor local players more than outside players. So we're not focused on those markets. We're also not focused on the US at this stage. It's just the players in the United States have really solid products, and I think it'll be more of a distraction. There's other places where we can make a bigger impact. There's a few countries we already incorporated in a few other countries in Asia and in Africa, and we'll probably review those once the next quarter has passed. Once we've really set our plan in action in Europe.
What do people think of Bitcoin in Africa? Because I know in Kenya they use like phone credits, M-Pesa, and Africa has just always been a very, I don't know. I mean, it seems apart from everything else. What kind of insights do you have from Africa about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's I think there's multiple versions of the Bitcoin story in Africa, and many of them are misleading. You will often see people stand on startup events on stage, and they will say like how Bitcoin is going to connect Africa to global finance, which may be true. But it's often presented in a way that it's imminent, that it's going to happen this year or next year, whereas the reality is that it holds huge potential, but it's going to take quite a while longer. So I think the main theme that you'll hear about, or initially about Bitcoin in Africa, is the one about remittances. That remittances is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and there's a large flow of capital into Africa from rich countries, and Bitcoin can greatly reduce the cost of those transfers, which is only somewhat true, or it's true in very limited use cases. Mostly the rails, the existing financial rails, I mean, as annoying as it is, or to use them or to say so, like the high traffic and high volume corridors between rich countries and African countries. It's a painless process if you use regular remittance mechanisms, And Bitcoin actually becomes quite ineffective if you have to send, let's say, $100 from the US to a village in the middle of Kenya. Bitcoin could be used to make that transfer happen. So a person in the US can take their $100, convert it on a platform like Coinbase or Gemini or whatever, convert it into Bitcoin. Bitcoin gets sent off to the person in the village in the middle of Africa, but that person would need a reliable internet connection. But most important, they would need the ability to sell that Bitcoin for Kenyan shillings. So if there's not an exchange in that country running, and an exchange at an appropriate with appropriate liquidity and trading volumes, and an exchange rate that's somewhat similar as what you would have expected if you used the banking system, it won't work as a remittance system. So it's in very limited use cases it works, but it doesn't scale. So that's one of the themes that you'll hear in Africa. But I think on a longer timeline, it might prove to be true that digital currencies, be it Bitcoin or Dash or something new, could hold potential for sending money. The other strong theme is just hedging against depreciation. If you see how currencies like the Naira or the South African Rand or the Zim dollar have taken a complete beating against the US dollar or against any major global currency, the hedging is a big theme. So it's also there's many. Africa is a big continent, and I think it's the mistake that journalists often make outside of Africa is this thing of like Africa as a country. Whereas the Bitcoin situation in places like South Africa would be years ahead of what it would be in a country like, let's say Zambia or Zimbabwe. And I think mostly the story now of Bitcoin in Africa is preventing preventing capital flight, maybe as a concern of the regulators, and another concern of theirs is preventing scams. Luckily, these seem to have disappeared a little bit, or been squashed out. But there was quite, unfortunately, a lot of scams that used Bitcoin as just classic straight up Ponzi schemes that you see in the US, Asia, and Latin America and elsewhere. They just kind of migrated to Africa and tried to exploit people. So unfortunately, we saw a little bit of a spike of that, but that's mostly disappeared. But I don't want to sound like all gloom and doom about Bitcoin in Africa. It's actually very exciting and very interesting because there's a lot of startups working in this space. And the great thing about it is it's an open technology. Anybody can actually build something on it. So we've seen some really encouraging projects that just come out of nowhere, where people will build integrations into let's say buying electricity. A lot of electricity in Africa works on a prepaid model. So you'll have a little meter in your house, and you have to go to a shop at the corner of the street or in the supermarket and give them a few bucks, and you buy some units of kilowatt hours of energy for your house, and you enter a code and you have more electricity. So people building integrations where you can use Bitcoin to do that or buy airtime with it, integrating it into e-commerce stores. And in most countries, you'll see this slow move where there are exchanges being founded that facilitate that conversion between the local currency and Bitcoin, which on a longer timeline will mean a lot. But I think in Africa, outside of Nigeria, South Africa, and maybe a handful of East African markets, I think it's going to be a while before you start seeing the leapfrog effect that you saw in other industries. For instance, historically in Africa, nobody had, or I shouldn't say nobody, majority of people didn't have a landline phone, or it was restricted to people living in large cities because of expensive infrastructure. Whereas with digital currencies, all you really need is a smartphone and an internet connection. And both of those are getting cheaper and cheaper and more widely distributed. So people went from not having a telephone and they jumped to having a mobile phone with really high mobile penetration. I think what we might see is people not having a traditional bank account to suddenly having a bank account that is purely digital. Now, whether that operates on Bitcoin or another digital currency or some token, or remains to be seen. But that's very much the direction that things are heading in.
Yeah, very interesting. I recently talked to the host of a show called Crypto Monedas, and we talked about how Bitcoin is being used in Latin America, and it's very different from how it's used in a lot of first world countries. We talked about Venezuela and Argentina and how it's being used for basic necessities, toilet paper and food and all that stuff. And so it makes me wonder about Africa. Even in the countries where it's being used right now, I know, for instance, South Africa is very different from Malawi, or the other countries in Africa. What else are you seeing? Is it being used in a different way than you anticipated in the various countries that you operate in? Any insights there?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that there was the story of Venezuela in some senses. I mean, not because of their economic malaise, because I think that's greatly what fueled the use of cryptocurrencies, because they have incredible hyperinflation. So people would be using something that is a bit more stable. My background is actually also in the payments industry, and that's kind of what made me fall in love with Bitcoin. Is I just saw this technology that could mean a much more efficient way of paying. If you think like how many times actually money change hands before it reaches the end destination, when you make a payment to a business, Bitcoin just does away with a lot of the inefficiency. So I saw a lot of potential. That's what made me drink the Kool-Aid. And I saw a lot of potential also in Africa. The reality, however, is that people is not one where people use it actively. I think or use it actively as a payment mechanism, at least. I think another big reason why that might be is I think a lot of people, and I mean, again, I can't speak for the whole continent, but at least a lot of the customers in our markets, and when we survey them and get feedback from them on how they use the currency, they see it very much like an equity, like a stock or a share in a company, or maybe in a technology. And most people right now who have bought this share of equity see it as something that will be more useful and more valuable in the future than what it is today. So if you, for instance, had, let's say, Tesla shares, and let's, for argument's sake, say we lived in a world where you could go to the supermarket and make a payment with your Tesla shares, with just fractions thereof. I don't think people would actually use those shares, because in their mind, they're saying, well, I have these shares because I hope it'll be worth more in the future. I believe in the vision of the company and what they're doing. And from what from what our data shows, is that people see Bitcoin, our consumers see Bitcoin in a very similar way. They see it as something that's going to be worth more in the future. So I'd rather not shave off fractions of this equity and this technology that I have. I'd rather just wait. And I would use it as I would just off-ramp back into the traditional system, and then use it that way.
That's a really interesting point you brought up, because I'm thinking about it, so I thought, and I think I would like Bitcoin to be accepted everywhere. I go to the coffee shop and, do you guys take Bitcoin? Of course we do, when I pay that way. But then again, if it is used that way, that's counter to my perception of it as a store of value, as something that, like you said, a stock in a company, a part of a movement where the price is going to keep going up and up. So it's kind of funny, the perception of a lot of people that hold and that just love Bitcoin and just think it's going to keep rallying. That's counter to what would work if you wanted to use it as an everyday currency.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky thing, and I mean that's one of the, I think, like what makes Bitcoin intellectually a very stimulating industry, is it's this new kind of financial experiment that's never really been done, and it's the largest financial experiment that's ever been done. Maybe we can stop calling it an experiment because it's so widely used and distributed now. But one of those questions since day one is like, will people use something that is limited in supply? As we saw in Japan a few years back, the Japanese saw that their money could buy 100,000 yen now can buy a certain amount of things, but in a year it'll probably buy more. So maybe I'm going to refrain from buying. I mean, it unlocks a lot of other interesting questions, like will consumerism change? Because right now we live with deflationary currencies, and that kind of encourages spending or investing, whereas something like Bitcoin might just encourage hoarding. So we don't. I have no idea. I have no idea what it might do. If I have a Bitcoin just takes over a little bit of the market of what is traditionally held with gold, I mean, there's every indication that the price should go up. And in one of our markets, particularly in South Africa has a history of gold and used to be the largest producer of gold in the world. And it's very much in the back of people's mind. And we do find that a lot of people here take to that comparison of saying Bitcoin is gold for the next generation. So who knows if 5 or 10 years from now, people would, rather than take that 5% of their investment portfolio that they put in metals with a limited availability, and if they put it in something that's just a lot easier to carry around and to store and to use, something like Bitcoin. I don't have the answers to that yet, but it's fascinating to witness the evolution.
It's been an interesting discussion. Now I get to sit there and think for a while about what Bitcoin means to me, so I appreciate that. So I'm not sure, what listeners would be from your neck of the woods, but tell people how can they find out more about Luno and possibly become a customer.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so basically they just have to go to luno.com or search for us in the Play Store or the App Store. And the onboarding process is pretty simple. We require an email address and a secure password, I hope. And then the next steps would just be for them to provide some identity verification if they wish to use us to buy and sell Bitcoin. They can also have a look on the website. Like I mentioned, we're available in Southeast Asia, Africa, and now in 36 countries in Europe too. And it's just www.luno, that's luno.com.
I appreciate you coming on the podcast, Werner. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me.
The Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference is coming to Dallas, Texas, February 16, 17, and 18 in 2018. If you know of a better way to get the latest insider knowledge about crypto, to hear directly from the top minds in this field, to interact personally with 800 fellow crypto lovers, hodlers, investors, miners, traders, developers, and founders, then I'd like to hear about it. If you don't, then you don't want to miss out. Register today for the Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference. Go to bitcoinsuperconference.com and register today as a super early bird to get the lowest rates on tickets and hotel rooms. That's bitcoinsuperconference.com.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.